Dust kicked up from the asphalt, rattling the hospital's loose window panes. Nobody noticed the quiet woman in the corner with her worn paperback. Not until the rotors deafened the ward and men in Kevlar breached the double doors, shouting a single name. Hers. Fluorescent bulbs in County General's emergency department didn't hum. They buzzed with an erratic, dying wasp frequency that drilled straight into the base of the skull. Josephine sat directly under the loudest one in the break room. She had her knees pulled up to her chest on a cracked vinyl chair that smelled perpetually of ammonia and old sweat. In her hands was a thick, dog-eared copy of a translated naval history book. She wasn't reading to better herself. She was reading to build a wall. A sharp hiss of the espresso machine preceded Shelby's entrance. The charge nurse kicked the door open with a rubber-soled clog, balancing 2 paper cups of burnt-smelling coffee. Shelby didn't look at Josephine. She didn't even offer a nod. She just walked to the opposite counter, pulled out her phone, and started scrolling the blue light, catching the heavy exhaustion bags under her eyes. Josephine turned a page. The paper was coarse soft at the edges from the moisture of her fingertips. Her cuticles were bitten raw, tiny crescents of dried scab lining her thumbnails. She wasn't a striking woman, nor did she try to be. Her scrubs were a faded, indeterminate blue, a size too large bunching at her ankles. Her dark hair was wrenched into a chaotic knot, secured by a plastic clip that was missing 3 teeth. To Shelby, to the doctors, to the entire administrative staff of County General, Josephine was part of the furniture. She was the reading nurse. The one you handed the literal shit jobs to because she never argued. Hey, Joe. Josephine didn't jump. She just stopped tracing the line of text with her eyes and looked up. Dr. Evans stood in the doorway. He was 32, wore Patagonia fleeces over his scrubs, and smelled like expensive spearmint gum and arrogance. Bed 4 needs a central line prepped, and the guy in bed 6 threw up his charcoal. Clean it up. Bed 4. Josephine repeated her voice a low, raspy scrape. It was the first time she had spoken in 5 hours. And 6. Yeah, faster is better. Evans didn't wait for a response. He was already turning away, shouting an order down the hall at an intern. Josephine placed a folded gum wrapper in her book, set it on the wobbly break room table, and stood. Her joints popped a dull, quiet sound in the empty room. She didn't sigh. Sighing implied disappointment, and Josephine had long ago stopped expecting anything different. The emergency room floor was a sensory nightmare at 3 in the morning. It smelled of iron cheap mint floor cleaner and the sour tang of digesting alcohol. Josephine grabbed a biohazard bag, a stack of blue towels, and a mop bucket. She bypassed bed 4 entirely and went straight to bed 6. A teenager, pale and trembling, was curled on his side, a massive puddle of black charcoal-stained vomit pooling on the linoleum. "Sorry," the kid mumbled, his cheek pressed against the railing. Josephine didn't offer a sweet maternal smile. She just pulled on a pair of purple nitrile gloves. "Don't talk. Focus on breathing through your nose, short breaths." Her tone was flat, devoid of bedside manner, yet undeniably steadying. She tossed the towels over the mess, letting them soak up the worst of it. The stench was gag-inducing, but her face remained entirely blank. She moved with a strange economic efficiency. No wasted motion. Wipe scoop bag, mop, bleach spray, wipe again. When she finished, she walked over to bed 4. The patient was a heavy-set man, sweating profusely, groaning in a drug-induced haze. Evans had already botched the prep. The tray was disorganized sterile fields, compromised by a careless toss of a syringe wrapper. Josephine stood there for a second. Her jaw tightened a brief, sharp ripple of muscle beneath her cheek. She stripped her gloves, sanitized her hands, and pulled fresh ones. Without a word to Evans, who was charting at the central desk 20 feet away, she rearranged the tray. She swapped the compromised needle, laid out the betadine swabs in exact chronological order of use, and adjusted the angle of the bed to perfectly expose the patient's internal jugular vein. She made it idiot-proof. Evans finally strolled over. He didn't thank her. He just grabbed the chlorhexidine and started scrubbing the patient's neck. "Can you hold the ultrasound probe?" "Actually, never mind, get Shelby to do it. You always hold it at a weird angle." Josephine stepped back. "Okay." She peeled off her gloves, threw them in the bin, and walked away. She didn't feel a sting of rejection. She felt the heavy, suffocating blanket of safety. If they thought she was useless, they wouldn't look closely. If they didn't look closely, they wouldn't ask questions. She retreated to her corner in the break room. She picked up her book. The hum of the broken light above her seemed to settle into her bones. She found her page, but her eyes wouldn't focus on the text. Her hands, previously steady while handling the biohazard waste, now possessed a minute, uncontrollable tremor. She pressed them flat against her thighs, staring at her raw cuticles until the shaking stopped. She was so tired. The kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix. The kind of tired that lived in the marrow. She closed her eyes, and the sterile smell of the hospital faded, replaced for a fraction of a second by the phantom scent of burning aviation fuel and copper. Her eyes snapped open. She dragged a deep breath of ammonia-scented air into her lungs, grounding herself. Just read, she told herself. Just be the reading nurse. It started as a vibration in the soles of her shoes. At 4:15, a.m. County General was in its dead zone. The drunk drivers were already in surgery or the morgue. The bar fights had been stitched up. The ER was a cavern of muted beeps and the scratching of pens on clipboards. Josephine was on chapter 14 when the water in the plastic cooler across the room began to ripple. She froze. She didn't look up at the ceiling. She looked at the water, the concentric circles shivering across the surface. Then came the sound. It wasn't the high-pitched, frantic whine of the hospital's contracted life flight Eurocopter. This was a heavy, percussive thud, a rhythmic beating that felt less like sound and more like changes in atmospheric pressure. Thump, 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 thump. The frequency was wrong for a civilian craft. It was too low, too dense. In the main ER, someone dropped a metal clipboard. The clatter was instantly swallowed by the escalating roar outside. Josephine stood up. The book slid off her lap, hitting the linoleum with a soft slap. She didn't pick it up. Her heart, normally a slow, disciplined metronome, kicked into a violent, irregular sprint. She stepped out of the break room. The double glass doors of the ambulance bay were shuddering in their tracks. Outside, the sodium streetlights illuminated a sudden violent sandstorm of urban debris. Fast food wrappers, wet floor signs, and loose gravel were being whipped into a cyclone. "What the hell is that?" Evans yelled over the noise, abandoning his computer terminal. "Is incoming tracking a trauma? Nobody called a bird. I don't have anything on the board," Shelby shouted back, pressing her hands over her ears. Dispatch didn't clear the pad. The helicopter wasn't landing on the roof pad. It was landing directly in the ambulance parking lot 70 feet from the sliding doors. Through the tinted glass, Josephine saw the silhouette. Matte black. No reflective tape. No red crosses. It was a heavily modified MH-60 sitting low and predatory on the asphalt. The rotors were still spinning, kicking up a blinding cloud of dust, but the side doors were already sliding open. "They can't park there!" Evans practically shrieked, his voice cracking with indignation. "They're blocking the bay. I'm calling security." Josephine took a step backward, putting herself behind a heavy structural pillar. Her throat was bone dry. She wiped her palms on her scrub pants, a useless nervous gesture she hadn't made in 4 years. 4 figures emerged from the dust cloud. They moved with a synchronized, heavy-footed urgency. They wore unmarked tactical gear plate carriers coated in fine gray dust, drop-leg holsters, and communication headsets. No badges, no names. They didn't pause at the sliding doors. They simply pried them open when the automatic sensors failed to trigger fast enough. The smell hit the sterile ER instantly. Exhaust ozone sweat and something dark and metallic. The lead operator stepped into the light. He was tall, his face obscured by a grime-streaked balaclava pulled down around his neck, revealing a jagged pink scar cutting through his dark beard. His eyes were cold, sweeping the room with rapid, terrifying efficiency. He didn't look at the medical equipment. He didn't look at the patients. He was looking for threats, and then for a target. "Who is in charge here?" the man demanded. His voice wasn't a yell, but it easily cut through the diminishing whine of the rotors outside. It was a voice used to being obeyed without question. Evans puffed out his chest, stepping forward, though his hands were trembling. "I am the attending physician. You cannot bring an unauthorized aircraft into a civilian drop zone. This is a massive FAA violation, and..." The operator didn't even blink. He walked right past Evans, brushing the doctor's shoulder hard enough to make Evans stumble sideways. The operator walked directly to the central desk, looming over a terrified Shelby. "I am looking for Josephine," he said. Shelby's mouth opened and closed like a fish. She looked around, panicked, her eyes darting across the room until they snagged on the pillar where Josephine was partially hidden. The operator caught the glance. He turned. Josephine pressed her spine against the cold concrete of the pillar. A brutal, agonizing war raged inside her chest. She could run. The rear fire exit was 30 feet away. She knew the blind spots in the security cameras, but she also knew these men. If she ran, they would lock down the hospital. They would tear the building down to the studs. She closed her eyes, took a ragged breath that tasted of jet fuel, and let out a long, shuddering exhale. Her posture changed. The slump in her shoulders vanished. The nervous, invisible aura she had cultivated for years evaporated, leaving behind something sharp and rigid. She stepped out from behind the pillar. "I'm here," she said. Her voice was no longer a raspy mumble. It was clear, carrying across the room with a cold resonance. The operator locked eyes with her. The tension in his massive shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. "We need you." Evans stared, utterly bewildered, looking back and forth between the armed commando and the quiet, unkempt nurse, who couldn't even hold an ultrasound probe right. "Wait, Joe. You're looking for Joe." Josephine ignored Evans. She kept her eyes on the lead operator. She noticed the fresh, dark stain seeping through the webbing of his vest. She noticed the erratic breathing of the man standing behind him. "I told command I was out," Josephine said, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "I told them 4 years ago. I'm a civilian. Command didn't send us." the operator replied, his voice dropping lower, a terrifying note of desperation creeping into the gravel. "We came off-grid. It's standard medical protocols, Josephine, and you're the only one who can keep him alive long enough to extract." She looked at the helicopter idling outside its blades, slicing through the night air. Then she looked back at her faded baggy scrubs. The life she had built, the quiet, boring, miserable life of being invisible, was crumbling like dry ash. "Who?" she asked, though a sickening knot in her stomach already knew the answer. "It's Ghost 2, the operator said. "He's bleeding out on the deck." Josephine's breath hitched. She didn't look at Shelby's wide eyes or Evans's gaping mouth. She reached up, pulled the broken plastic clip from her hair, letting the dark tangle fall around her shoulders. "Give me a trauma kit," Josephine snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. "And tell your pilot to spin up. We have a 3-minute window before he codes." Rotors beat the heavy air into a physical, suffocating weight. Josephine grabbed the raw metal grab handle, hauling her small frame into the cavernous, vibrating rear of the MH-60. The temperature dropped instantly, shocking her system. Outside, it was a stagnant, humid summer morning. Inside, the environmental controls blasted at freezing temperatures. The compartment smelled violently of aviation fuel, hot electronics, burnt carbon, and the unmistakable sharp ozone tang of recent gunfire. 4 heavily armed operators piled in behind her boots, slamming onto the deck. The side door slid shut with a heavy mechanized clank. Instantly, the outside noise was muffled, replaced by a dense, vibrating roar that became a physical presence. The frequency shuddered through the thin rubber soles of her hospital clogs, traveled up her shins, and settled directly behind her eyes, causing a dull ache to bloom at the base of her skull. She didn't look at the operator named Miller. She looked only at the stretcher bolted securely to the center deck plates. Garrett lay strapped underneath thick nylon webbing. He looked gray, not merely pale, but the flat ashen hue of poured concrete. His tactical vest had been violently sheared away by trauma shears, leaving jagged, frayed nylon edges, framing a massive chest wound. His torso was wrapped in crude pressure dressings that were actively failing, completely saturated in a heavy dark crimson. Josephine dropped to her knees on the non-slip metal floor. The coarse sandpaper-like surface immediately bit through her thin, baggy scrub pants, scraping the skin of her kneecaps. She ignored the sting. Her hands hovered over his ruined chest for a fraction of a second. A violent tremor ran through her fingers. 4 years. 4 years of pushing charcoal logging temperatures, sweeping floors, and hiding in the sterile break room. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting down a sudden, acidic wave of nausea. Focus on the mechanics, she told herself, clamping her jaw tight. Just pipes and pressure. Mechanics. She snapped open the hard-case trauma kit Miller kicked across the floor toward her. It was heavy military issue. Organized, dense, entirely lacking the soft-edge, color-coded safety of civilian hospital equipment. "What's the exact injury?" she screamed over the engine noise, though her voice barely carried past her own ears. Miller knelt opposite her, his massive frame hunched uncomfortably under the low ceiling. "Shrapnel upward trajectory under the floating ribs. We packed the cavity, but the packing is not holding." Josephine tore a pair of heavy black rubber gloves from the kit. They were 2 sizes too large, the fingertips extending past her own. She shoved her hands into them anyway, snagging a pair of heavy-duty shears. She began cutting away the saturated, ruined bandages. The smell hit her, then a massive, overwhelming wave. A distinct, heavy copper stench, mixed with sour adrenaline, sweat dirt, and explosive residue. The sheer volume of the hemorrhage was terrifying. As the last layer of gauze peeled back, a steady dark pulse of fluid welled up from a jagged gaping tear just below Garrett's diaphragm. It wasn't a clean surgical slice. It was a ragged, brutal laceration that had shredded muscle and fat. Panic, cold and sharp as crushed ice, spiked in her throat. She wasn't a surgeon. She was a combat medic. Her job was to stop the leak, plug the hole, and keep the brain oxygenated long enough for a real doctor to intervene. Garrett shifted violently on the metal table. A wet, agonizing rattle escaped his cracked lips. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing the rolling whites of his eyes. "Garrett," she said, slapping his cheek. It wasn't a gentle nurse-like tap. It was a hard, stinging strike designed to jolt the nervous system. "Stay with me. Look right at me." His gaze wandered aimlessly around the dark ceiling before dropping to lock onto her face. A terrible, confused recognition sparked in his blown pupils. "Joe," he gasped, his voice bubbling. "Shut up. Save your oxygen." She reached directly into the wound cavity. No hesitation. She shoved two gloved fingers directly into the torn, slick flesh, probing blind for the severed artery. The heat inside his abdomen contrasted sharply with his freezing, clammy skin. It was incredibly slippery. Her fingers slid off slick internal tissue, grasping frantically in the dark. Garrett screamed. It was a horrific guttural sound of pure agony that easily cut through the mechanical roar of the helicopter's twin turbines. Josephine gritted her teeth until her jaw popped. Her stomach churned violently. She hated this. She hated the raw violence of it, the absolute desecration of the human body. Her fingers finally hooked around a thick, pulsing tube. Her hand clamped down with brutal force, pinning the slick vessel hard against his spinal column. The pulsing well of dark red instantly slowed to a sluggish, manageable seep. "Got it!" She gasped, her entire arm trembling violently from the extreme physical pressure she had to maintain. "Miller clamps, now, and give me a hemostatic sponge." Miller fumbled. His thick tactical gloves lacked dexterity. He dropped the sterile packaging, the plastic skittering away across the vibrating floor deck. "Damn it, Miller, focus," Josephine barked. The quiet, invisible reading nurse was entirely gone. The woman kneeling in the pooling crimson was a dictator forged in chaotic, high-casualty combat zones. Miller snatched another sponge, ripped the thick plastic open with his teeth, and slapped the chemically treated gauze into her free hand. She packed the wound, forcing the stiff material deep into the cavity with her thumb, while slowly, agonizingly retracting her pinning fingers. Suddenly, the helicopter banked hard to the left. Evasive maneuvers. Gravity shifted violently. Josephine was thrown completely off balance. She slammed sideways into the cold fuselage wall, her left shoulder taking the brunt of the heavy impact. The tray of instruments flipped over, scattering metal surgical tools across the dark deck. Garrett's portable monitor began to shriek. A rapid, frantic descending alarm. "We are losing pressure," Miller shouted, bracing his boots against the bulkhead. "Massive altitude drop." Josephine scrambled back to the stretcher, her knees bruised and sliding uncontrollably on the wet, slick floor. She didn't feel heroic. She didn't feel brave. She felt sick. She felt a profound, overwhelming urge to curl into a tight ball on the floor and let the world simply end. Instead, she grabbed a thick plastic bag of saline, jammed a thick gauge IV line into Garrett's uninjured arm, and squeezed the bag with both hands, using her body weight to force artificial fluids into his rapidly collapsing veins. Time suspended itself in the freezing, vibrating cabin. Josephine operated in a bizarre state of hyper-focused dissociation. She watched her own hands work as if they belonged to an entirely different person. They were stained dark red, shaking constantly from adrenaline, yet moving with an aggressive, necessary precision. She sutured the temporary artery clamp into place using a heavy curved needle that required brutal physical force to punch through Garrett's thick, resistant skin. Every time the MH-60 hit a sudden pocket of air turbulence, her stomach dropped into her shoes. She clamped her jaw so tight her back teeth ached, tasting the sharp, distinct metallic tang of her own bitten inner cheek. Garrett's breathing was impossibly shallow, a jagged, uneven, terrifying rhythm. "Heart rate is threading," Miller announced, his eyes glued to the illuminated portable monitor screen. 60, dropping fast, pushing epinephrine. Josephine muttered, her voice raspy and dry. She snapped the plastic cap off a pre-filled emergency syringe. Her rubber gloves were too slick. The plastic barrel slipped right through her grip, clattering sharply against the metal deck and rolling completely under the bolted stretcher. Fuck. She slammed her fist against the unforgiving deck. The raw, ugly imperfection of the moment completely shattered her stoic facade. She wasn't a well-oiled machine anymore. She was exhausted, terrified, and operating purely on 4 years of rusted, degrading muscle memory. She dove sideways, her cheek pressing against the filthy, fluid-streaked metal floor fingers, blindly scraping under the low metal frame. Dust, grit, and sticky residue coated her dry lips. She snagged the plastic syringe, pulled herself up roughly, and wiped the needle port right on her filthy scrub pants, a massive fireable protocol violation she simply didn't care about anymore. She injected the powerful stimulant directly into the central IV line. "Come on," she whispered, leaning intimately over Garrett's gray face. The smell of his sweat was incredibly pungent, sour with raw fear and deep physiological shock. "Don't do this. Don't make me come out of retirement just to watch you die on the floor." Silence followed. Only the deafening, continuous mechanical roar of the engines and the high-pitched whine of the main transmission filled the space. Then the monitor beeped. A stronger, more defined ascending note. Miller exhaled. It was a long, ragged, incredibly human sound. 80, 90, holding steady. Josephine collapsed backward onto her heels. She didn't cheer. She didn't smile in relief. She just let her head drop heavy forward, her chin hitting her chest. Her hospital scrubs were entirely ruined, clinging heavily to her shins. Her cuticles, previously picked dry and clean, were now packed tight with dark, organic grime. She stared down at her hands. The deep tremors returned violently and uncontrollably, shaking her wrists. Miller shifted his heavy weight, reaching out a massive, heavily gloved hand to offer a green aluminum canteen. "Drink." She took it without looking at him. Her hands shook so badly, the metal rim clinked loudly against her front teeth. The water inside was lukewarm and tasted heavily of cheap plastic, but it was easily the best thing she had ever swallowed in her life. "Where exactly are we going?" she asked, her voice finally returning to its normal raspy, quiet cadence. The commanding dictator had retreated completely, leaving behind an exhausted, cynical shell. "FOB Charlie," Miller replied, using the military designation for a classified off-grid medical facility hidden somewhere deep in the state's interior. 15 minutes out, full trauma surgery team is waiting on the tarmac. Josephine nodded slowly, staring at the rivulets of condensation forming on the aluminum wall. She looked back at Garrett. His chest rose and fell in a steady artificial rhythm, supported entirely by the plastic bag mask Miller had taken over pumping. He was stable. Barely on a razor's edge, but stable. She looked down at her faded baggy ER scrubs. They were completely unrecognizable now. Just like her life. County General was permanently gone. Dr. Evans Shelby, the broken buzzing fluorescent light, the quiet safe corner in the ammonia-scented break room. The dog-eared translated naval history book left lying face down on the cheap linoleum floor. None of it existed anymore. She couldn't go back. You don't step out of the shadows, expose the wolf to the world, and then try to put the itchy sheep's clothing back on. You know, Josephine said, quietly staring at the blank metal wall of the fuselage, her eyes completely vacant. I hated working the ER. Miller looked at her, his grim, terribly scarred face softening just a fraction of an inch in the dim cabin lighting. Why stay then? Because it was incredibly boring. She wiped a heavy streak of grime from her forehead with the back of her bare wrist. Boring is safe. Boring doesn't wake you up at 2 a.m, tasting ash and cordite. The heavy helicopter began its final descent. The specific pitch of the overhead rotors changed rapidly, deepening significantly as the aircraft slowed its forward momentum. The heavy vibration shifted from a forward thrust to a jarring vertical shudder that rattled her teeth. Josephine unbuckled herself from the wall restraint. She didn't feel a triumphant, glorious return to form. She felt the heavy, suffocating yoke of old responsibility settling firmly back onto her tired shoulders. She had spent 4 long years trying desperately to bury the ghosts reading dry history books, to drown out the loud, violent present. But history had a remarkably funny way of always catching up. The landing gear hit the concrete tarmac with a heavy, spine-compressing jolt. The rear hydraulic ramp immediately began to lower, letting in the blinding, chaotic glare of halogen floodlights and the frantic, overlapping shouting of a waiting trauma team rushing the pad. Josephine stood up slowly. Her stiff joints popped loudly in protest. She grabbed the plastic IV bag from its ceiling hook, holding it high above Garrett. She didn't look back at Miller. She just walked steadily down the metal ramp into the blinding white light, her rubber clogs leaving dark, heavy footprints on the pristine, wet concrete. The quiet reading nurse was dead. The combat medic had clocked in. Did Josephine's brutal mid-air triage keep you entirely on the edge of your seat? The intense transition from the invisible reading nurse back to a hardened black ops medic proves that some ghosts absolutely refuse to stay buried. What do you think awaits her at FOB Charlie? Drop your theories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this raw, high-stakes drama, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more intense storytelling.